In chapters 3 and 4, we learned of the great plot to destroy all the Jews in the entire Persian Empire. How Esther learned of this through Mordecai, and after a conversation with Mordecai, determined that at the risk of her life, she would go to the king, even though the king had not summoned her in 30 days, to plead for her people. Now, beginning in chapter 5, we will see what Esther does to in response to this and how she approaches the king. So in chapter 5, verses 1 through 8, it says this: Now it came about on the third day that Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace in front of the king's rooms. And the king was sitting on his royal throne in the throne room opposite the entrance to the palace. When the king saw Esther the queen standing in the court, she obtained favor in his sight. And the king extended to Esther the golden scepter which was in his hand. So Esther came near and touched the top of the scepter. Then the king said to her, What is troubling you, Queen Esther? And what is your request? Even to half of the kingdom it shall be given to you. Esther said, If it pleases the king, may the king and Haman come this day to the banquet that I have prepared for him. Then the king said, Bring Haman quickly, that we may do as Esther desires. So the king and Haman came to the banquet which Esther had prepared. As they drank their wine at the banquet, the king said to Esther, What is your petition? For it shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to half of the kingdom it shall be done. So Esther replied, My petition and my request is, If I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and to do what I request, may the king and Haman come to the banquet which I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king says. Now, in verse 1, where it says the third day, that refers to the 3-day fast requested by Esther in chapter 4, verse 16, and that had now been completed. Now, Esther had violated the law by coming to the inner court without being summoned, as indicated back in chapter 4, verse 11. However, she showed discretion by waiting there instead of simply coming into the king's immediate presence. And the king's offer to give her anything, up to even half the kingdom, is probably an oriental courtesy not to be taken too literally. Remember, when Salome, Herodias's daughter, danced in front of King Herod and pleased the king similarly said to Salome, I'll give you anything, up to half my kingdom. Well, Salome said, what I want is the head of John the Baptist on a platter. But so, you can have these sort of hyperbole. I'll give you anything up to half my kingdom. It's probably not a literal thing. Again, I mentioned the Septuagint makes a number of additions to the book, and it adds a number of verses at the beginning of chapter 5 about how Esther approached the king, how she fainted, and so on and so forth. None of that is in the Hebrew. Now, it's important to note, though, that Esther had done more than just relying upon prayer and fasting alone. She clearly had thought a great deal about how best to approach the king. And this is necessary because this was a matter of life and death, and she knew it, both for herself and for her people. One scholar notes that Esther dressed formally for the occasion in full royal robes as if she were appearing at a state function. This also suggests that she adorned herself in a way that she knew would please the king. We've already noted her prudence in not just marching up to the king, but also, when the king promised her anything up to half the kingdom, she did not immediately make her request known. Instead, she invited the king and Haman to a banquet. Now, in doing that, she was following Middle Eastern custom where business deals traditionally followed meals. And she may have felt that the time was not right to make her specific request until after the king had had plenty to eat and drink and so on. So, this is a tactic whereby she then, by having the king and Haman come to her, she was in control of the setting and so on. And so hopefully this was all working to her advantage. She knew the customs. And again, that makes me think, for example, when Paul was being attacked and he knew the law. He said when he was going to be flogged by the Romans, I believe he was in Jerusalem at the time, he said, "Is it legal to flog a Roman citizen?" And the soldiers said, "Oh, I didn't know you were a Roman citizen. I had to pay for my citizenship." And Paul said, "I was born a citizen." And then when he was being accused, he knew that he had the right to appeal to Caesar, and he did so. So Paul knew the law, he knew the customs, and so did Esther. And her knowledge of customs and so on and so forth, and the law, she utilized that to her advantage here. Again, that's a lesson for us. We need to think about things. Yes, we need to pray, fasting and prayer and so on, but we need to think about things. We need to know the type of actions to do that can work best to our advantage, given the law and the customs of the place where we are. Now, and this is particularly true if we are in situations that involve risk, as was the case with Esther. Remember, she was living in the lap of luxury. She was willing to risk all that she had, including her life, for the sake of her people, in order to be faithful to God. All Christians need to remember that, although we may have education, success, wealth, power, health, and other benefits of this life, our faithfulness to God comes first and is more important than all of those things. And we need to remember that everything we have ultimately has been lent to us by God to be used for His glory and His honor. And if we love Him truly, we should be willing to give up everything that we have, just as Esther was willing to do so. Now, this is telling us something else. It's telling us that God did not give up on Esther, and He doesn't give up on us. Remember, she began. She used her beauty. She didn't say that she was Jewish. She ate the food provided for her. She took a new Persian name instead of her Hebrew name. She participated in the beauty pageant. She did whatever Haggai said. She slept with a Gentile before being married, and then married a Gentile unbeliever. She basically, at the beginning of this book, compromised in every way with the world. And yet, the gospel is telling us that God does not just bless and save people who live morally upright, impeccable lives. Instead, God gives His grace to people who don't ask for it, who don't deserve it, and often do not even fully appreciate it when we receive His grace. He knows that we are dust. He knows that the spirit may be willing, but the flesh is weak. And He gives us chance after chance to slowly by slowly, through what we go through, turn us into the kind of people He created us to be in the first place. And we see that in Esther, who was transformed from being a compliant beauty queen to a woman of courage, strength, and character. That's the way He works to transform us as well. Now, even though her banquet was a success, she did not immediately make her request known to the king, but she requested that the king and Haman come to another banquet on the next day. And again, this shows the providence of God. It also, the delay is important, as we're going to see in a few minutes, but I think it was also creating some suspense in the mind of the king. What does she want? Look at how she's treating me to these banquets and so on. But what is it that she is really after? So then, in chapter 5, verses 9 through 13, they go on to say, Then Haman went out that day glad, because he'd been invited by the queen to the banquet with the king, and pleased of heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, and that Mordecai did not stand up or tremble before him, Haman was filled with anger against Mordecai. Haman controlled himself, however. He went to his house and sent for his friends and his wife Zeresh. Then Haman recounted to them the glory of his riches and the number of his sons, and every instance where the king had magnified him, and how he had promoted him above the princes and servants of the king. Haman also said, Even Esther the queen, let no one but me come with the king to the banquet which she had prepared, and tomorrow I am invited by her with the king. Yet all of this does not satisfy me every time I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. Well, this passage tells us and shows us the malignancy and, in fact, the irrationality of hatred and pride. I mean, Haman recounted to his wife and his friends all the blessings and honors that had been bestowed upon him. And yet, he was a second to the king himself, and yet none of that satisfied him. Just the sight of Mordecai not paying him honor was enough to send him into a rage. And think about it. It's similar, not identical, but similar. Look at Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve lived in a perfect environment. They had fantastic bodies. They had been given fruitful work to do. They walked with God in the garden. They had every advantage. There was only one command. You can eat anything you want, just not the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So what did they focus on? The tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and they ate. Just like, excuse me, think, of all the blessings God has given. And yet we all tend to do like Adam and Eve did, and so much like Haman did. You focus on the one thing you don't have, the one thing that galls you. And as with Adam and Eve, and as we're going to see with Haman, it leads to disaster and our own downfall. Because pride, hatred, it's like a cancer of the soul. And we see that in Haman. But then, in verse 14 of chapter 5, then Zeresh, his wife, Haman's wife, and all his friends said to him, Have a gallows 50 cubits high made, and in the morning ask the king to have Mordecai hanged on it. Then go joyfully with the king to the banquet. And the advice pleased Haman, so he had the gallows made. All right? Now, so Haman, had this gallows 50 cubits high, that'd be about 75 feet high, as a sign to the people of Susa, a public sign of Haman's importance, and a public humiliation of Mordecai. Now, notice that Haman constructed the gallows first without telling the king. He was going to tell the king later on what it was for. But in the translation, it says, and in the morning, ask the king to have Mordecai hanged on it. Typically, the Hebrew word translated here as act is typically translated say or speak. In other words, and the English Standard Version brings this out, and what's really going on, it translates, and in the morning, tell the king to have Mordecai hanged on it. And again, that shows Haman's arrogance and his self-centeredness and self-importance. And it shows how hatred can warp us. He didn't wait till the 13th day of the month of Adar to have Mordecai killed. He resolves to do it right now before the queen's second banquet. But again, this is another example of what Proverbs 16 verse 18 says, pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before stumbling, which leads us to chapter 6. And it is in chapter 6 that Haman's downfall begins. Now, and that is where, again, remember, this is, Esther was having two banquets. Now, in the night between the first one and the second one, something important takes place. We find out in chapter 6, verses 1 through 3. During that night, the king could not sleep, so he gave an order to bring the book of records, the chronicles, and they were read before the king. It was found written what Mordecai had reported concerning Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who were doorkeepers, that they had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. The king said, "What honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this?" Then the king's servants who attended him said, "Nothing has been done for him." Now, this is another one of these coincidences that shows God's providence behind the scenes. Think of all that's going on. And again, God is not named. Everything appears to be natural. But look at this series of events. It just happened that the king was unable to sleep. And it just happened that this was the night before Esther's second banquet. And it just happened that the king asked for the book of the Chronicles to be read to him. And it just happened that the portion of the Chronicles that was read to him reported how Mordecai had saved the king's life. And it just happened that the king inquired about that and was informed that nothing had been done to honor Mordecai. And then, as we're going to see in the next few verses, Haman just happened to have just entered the outer court of the king's palace to speak to the king about hanging Mordecai. And Haman just happened, as we will see, to misread the intentions about who the king desired to honor. And so this is where the situation starts to change. And now, one reason why the king probably inquired as to what had been done to honor Mordecai was that typically in the Persian Empire, royal benefactors were rewarded with special clothing, horses, gold ornaments, vast land holdings, and the like. And so, but so the king's informed nothing had been done. So we'll see what happens then. And the rest here of chapter 6, verses 4 through 11 go on to say, "So the king said, 'Who is in the court?' Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace in order to speak to the king about hanging Mordecai on the gallows, which he had prepared for him. The king's servant said to him, 'Behold, Haman is standing in the court.' And the king said, 'Let him come in.' So Haman came in, and the king said to him, 'What is to be done for the man whom the king desires to honor?' And Haman said to himself, 'Whom would the king desire to honor more than me?' Then Haman said to the king, 'For the man whom the king desires to honor, let him bring a royal robe which the king has worn, and the horse on which the king has ridden, and on whose head a royal crown has been placed. And let the robe and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble princes, and let them array the man whom the king desires to honor, and lead him on horseback through the city square, and proclaim before him, Thus it shall be done to the man whom the king desires to honor.' Then the king said to Mordecai, 'Take quickly the robes and the horse, as you have said, and do so for Mordecai the Jew, who is sitting at the king's gate. Do not fall short in anything of all you have said.' So Haman took the robe and the horse, and arrayed Mordecai, and led him on horseback through the city square, and proclaimed before him, 'Thus it shall be done to the man whom the king desires to honor.'" This is one of the great ironic reversals in this book. It was Haman who just happened to arrive in order to speak to the king about having Mordecai hanged. And again, Haman's pride shows itself. He pridefully thinks that the man whom the king wants to honor, of course, is Haman himself. You see, Haman didn't need money. He was going to pay 10,000 talents of silver to have the Jews killed, but he needed respect. And consequently, that's why he says that the king should honor the man by putting the royal robes on, seating him on a royal horse, having the crown put on him, and having the most trusted prince lead the man through the city square, saying, "Thus it shall be to the man whom the king desires to honor." This incident, again, is an example of the biblical principle that whoever exalts himself shall be humbled, and whoever humbles himself shall be exalted. And, again, it's one of these subtle pointers to the gospel. Haman was seeking the approval of the king, but he ended up being humbled involuntarily. But the ultimate king, Jesus Christ, voluntarily humbled himself and took on the role of a servant so that we would be exalted. Now, one might think it's strange that the king would knowingly honor a Jew after so recently enacting an edict to kill all the Jews. But remember, Haman never named the Jews as the people he wanted to kill, and he never named Mordecai. And the king never inquired who that certain people was. And Haman is the one who drew up the edict, sealed it with the royal signet, and so it's likely that the king had never seen the edict and did not know that it was the Jews who were the people who were going to be killed. And there is nothing to indicate that the king knew of Haman's hatred of Mordecai either, which then leads to chapter 6, verses 12 and 13. Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman hurried home, mourning with his head covered. Haman recounted to Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends everything that had happened to him. Then his wise men and Zeresh, his wife, said to him, "If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish origin, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him." Now, so the king's honoring Mordecai, note, it does not appear to have changed Mordecai's circumstances. He remained a Jew awaiting execution pursuant to Haman's edict. So Mordecai returned to the place where he had been. Now, Haman returns home in humiliation, and he received no comfort from his wife and friends. Instead, they prophetically announce Haman's doom. So again, chapter 6 is where the tables turn. They begin to turn, and we will see them turned the full way at the end of chapter 6 and in chapter 7. So chapter 6, verse 14 through chapter 7, verse 6 say this. While they were still talking with him, while Haman's wife and friends were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hastily brought Haman to the banquet which Esther had prepared. Now the king and Haman came to drink wine with Esther the queen. And the king said to Esther, on the second day also, as they drank their wine at the banquet, "What is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to half of the kingdom it shall be done." Then Queen Esther replied, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given to me as my petition, and my people as my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. Now, if we had only been sold as slaves, men and women, I would have remained silent, for the trouble would not have been commensurate with the annoyance to the king." Then King Ahasuerus asked Queen Esther, "Who is he? Where is he? Who would presume to do this?" Esther said, "A foe and an enemy is this wicked Haman." Then Haman became terrified before the king and queen. Now, typically guests were escorted to oriental feasts. So verse 14, where it says the eunuchs came and escorted Haman, is not unusual. But the reference to the haste with which Haman was brought to the banquet may suggest that he did not have time to compose himself following his humiliation and his wife's prophecy of doom. Now, notice how wine, I mentioned this earlier in an earlier lecture, wine has been an important part of the plot of the book. When the king was merry with wine, that's when he gave the order to Vashti. And her refusal ultimately resulted in Esther becoming the queen. Now, as they drink wine, the king again asks Esther what her petition is. And this time she answers, and her answer will result in the death of Haman and the saving of the Jews. But notice again how carefully Esther proceeded to answer the king. His repeating to her that he would give her up to half the kingdom was a good sign that she retained his favor. But notice she did not immediately mention the edict to kill all the Jews and request that the king revoke it. Instead, she was very deferential. She says, if I found favor in your sight, O king, if it pleases the king. And then she asked for something that without the king's knowing any more, he would have to grant. In other words, she said, let my life be given to me as my petition. And then immediately coupled that with, my people as my request. Now, even now, she does not even specifically mention that she is a Jew. Now, without giving the king time to respond, she then immediately proceeds with an explanation of why this is her petition. And she is actually subtly, she's repeating the language of the edict. They should be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. But she's also subtly arguing that it's in the king's own interest to grant her petition, because she says, if we'd have simply been sold as slaves, I wouldn't have troubled you. But because then, you'd have the labor and the wealth that could be done by your slaves. But I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, which means you're going to lose the benefit of all the labor of the people. And her reference to the word sold alludes to the 10,000 talents of silver that Haman had said that he would pay into the treasury. And again, she's very smart in how she's proceeding. She's making her petition as personal as possible. She says, I wouldn't, have troubled the king if I'd have simply been, or my people have been sold as slaves. But then when the king asks, who has presumed to do this? Then she immediately responds, a foe and an enemy is this wicked Haman. Now, Haman became terrified, and with good reason, because he knew his fate had been sealed by what Esther said. And the entire scene, again, is reminiscent. Remember, when Nathan the prophet came into David after David had slept with Bathsheba. And so Nathan very cagily told the story about a rich man who took a poor man's little ewe lamb to feed the rich man's guests. And when Nathan had set the scene, and David became very angry, and said, that man will die. Then Nathan exclaimed, you are the man. It's very similar to the way Esther proceeded here, which leads us to the rest of chapter 7, verses 7 through 10. The king arose from his anger from drinking wine, and went to the palace garden. But Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther, for he saw the harm that had been determined against him by the king. Now when the king returned from the palace garden into the place where they were drinking wine, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. Then the king said, will he even assault the queen with me in the house? As the word went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs who were there before the king, said, behold, indeed, the gallows standing at Haman's house is 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on behalf of the king. And the king said, hang him on it. So they hanged Haman on the gallows which he had prepared for Mordecai, and the king's anger subsided. Now, the king's leaving to go into the palace garden may have been because he was too angry to speak, or he needed some time to consider what to do. But note that Haman has not yet said a word. And again, the scene mirrors the opening scene with Vashti. There, the king acted in haste and never asked Vashti, why didn't you come when I commanded? Well, here the king acts abruptly, and he never asked Haman, how could you have done such a thing? Had he done so, Haman might have pointed out that everything what he had told the king back in chapter 3 about the people who didn't obey the king's rules, he could have reminded the king, you gave me the signet and I prepared the edict. And he could have reminded the king that we even drank over it, and Haman could have concluded by saying, I had no idea that Esther was a Jew. She never even hinted at that to me. I don't think she hinted at that to you, did she? Had I known that, I never would have issued the decree in the form in which it was issued. But, you know, the king's going off into the garden may also have got him to think about this edict, but as things happened, Haman never got the chance to speak. It's almost comical. He falls on the couch, and the king misinterprets it as him trying to sexually assault the queen. And so then the word goes out, basically, kill him, hang him on it. But notice that Esther didn't, correct the king's misunderstanding. So as a result, Haman is actually executed because the king thinks he attempted to sexually assault the queen. And so it's just one of these examples of Haman's pride. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before stumbling. And think about this, the pride. Had Haman simply ignored Mordecai, Mordecai hadn't paid homage to Haman, if Haman would have ignored that, he never would have plotted against the Jews, and we would be reading a considerably different story of Esther. But again, this exemplifies, as Psalm 9 says, in the work of his own hands the wicked is snared. And Psalm 7, his mischief will return upon his own head, and his violence will descend upon his own pate. So the great reversal occurs. Now Haman is the one who is hanged, not Mordecai.